Welcome. Close your eyes now, if you have not already. Take a slow, easy breath in through your nose, and let it drift out through your mouth, unhurried, like a tide pulling back from the shore. There is no need to breathe in any particular way. Simply let the breath move as it wishes, and let each exhale carry something away, a thought that does not need attending to tonight. A tension in the shoulders you had stopped noticing was there, a small worry that has followed you into the evening and can, now, be set down. There is nowhere you need to be. Nothing you need to decide. No task waiting at the edge of your thoughts that cannot wait until morning. Right now, in this moment, you have only one thing to do, and that is to rest. Feel the weight of your body settling, into the bed, into the pillow, into the quiet. Notice how gravity is always there, always patient, always holding you without effort. You do not have to work at being held. You simply are. And the surface beneath you accepts that weight completely, without negotiation, without condition. It is enough, simply, to lie here. Take another breath. Slow and full. Let your shoulders drop a little more on the exhale. Let your jaw soften. Let your hands open gently, fingers loose, palms at ease. If you notice your mind reaching for something, a plan, a conversation, the shape of tomorrow, let it reach, and then let it find nothing to hold. And let it come back to the body, to the breath, to the dark and quiet room where you are lying, safe and still. Tonight, we are going somewhere warm and ancient. We are going to a place where the land curves gently toward the sea, where wooden docks stretch over still water, and where the smell of salt and timber and distant cooking fires drifts through the evening air like something half-remembered from a dream you once had as a child. A place where time moves slowly, where the rain is not something to run from but something to sit beneath, something to listen to, something that has its own rhythm and its own patience and asks only that you match it. We are going to an old Malay seaport, a harbor town that has stood at the edge of the sea for longer than anyone still living can remember. A place of boats and nets and lanterns. Of tidal rhythms and quiet industry. Of people who have shaped their lives around the patience of the ocean, who have learned that the sea gives and the sea withholds according to its own logic, and that the wisest response to both is simply to go out again in the morning with good equipment and an open hand. The year is not important. What matters is the feeling of it. The texture of wooden planks worn smooth by generations of bare feet. The sound of rain tapping softly on banana leaves and corrugated rooftops. The warmth of an oil lamp glowing through a thin curtain in the early hours before dawn. The smell of the morning, salt and damp earth and the first smoke of the day rising from kitchens where fires are being coaxed into life, where water is being set to boil, where the first small ceremonies of another day are beginning with the same quiet care they have begun every morning in this place for as long as the place has been. In this town, there is a man named Arman. He is not a remarkable man in the way that stories usually demand. There is no great destiny pressing down upon him, no grand quest calling him away from his life. He is simply a good man. A quiet man. A fisherman of 29 years who wakes before the sun each morning, who mends what is broken, who helps his neighbors without being asked, and who cares for his ailing father with a steadiness that has no name but love. Tonight, you will follow Arman through the rain. You will walk with him along the docks. You will breathe the salt air beside him, and watch the lantern sway, and listen to the water move beneath the boats. You will sit with him in the quiet mornings and go out with him onto the sea and return with him to the small house above the waterfront where his father waits and the tea is warm and the day arranges itself around them with the unhurried ease of days that are lived close to the things that matter. And somewhere along the way, you will find that your body has grown heavier, softer, and your thoughts have drifted far from the shores of waking. There is nothing here that will startle you. Nothing that will ask anything of you. Only the rain, and the sea, and the slow, steady rhythm of a life lived with care. Let your breathing settle. Let your eyes stay gently closed. And let the story begin. Chapter 1. The rain arrives at the harbor. The rain always came before the light. It arrived in the deep hours of the night, sometime between the last call of the cicadas and the first uncertain stirring of the birds. It came without announcement, no rumble of thunder, no shift in the wind that you could point to and say, "There, that was when it changed." One moment the air was still and close, heavy with the warmth that had been building all day against the skin and the walls and the broad surfaces of the leaves, and the next there was only the sound. Soft at first. A whisper on the water. A tapping against the broad leaves of the banana trees that grew in loose clusters along the edge of the village. Then fuller, steadier, until the whole world seemed wrapped in a single continuous murmur, as though the sky had simply decided to speak and had not yet decided to stop. This was the rainy season, and in the old Malay Seaport, the rainy season was not an interruption of life. It was life itself, in one of its most essential forms. The fishermen understood the rain the way they understood the tides, not as something to be managed, but as something to be read, to be felt in the body, to be accommodated the way one accommodates a beloved elder whose habits are fixed and whose presence is, in truth, a comfort. You planned around the rain. You kept your equipment dry and your lines coiled and your bilge pumped, and you went out when the rain permitted and you waited when it did not, and in the waiting you did the other work, the mending, the maintaining, the slow and patient attention to the small things that kept the larger things sound. The harbor curved gently inland from the sea, a natural shelter worn smooth by centuries of use. Wooden docks extended from the shore on thick pilings darkened by salt and years, and along these docks the boats rested, long, narrow fishing vessels with prows that curved upward like sleeping questions, their hulls painted in colors that had faded to something softer than their original intentions. Blue that had become a kind of gray. Red that had quieted to the color of old clay. Each boat moved with the water beneath it, rocking in a slow, continuous cadence, the ropes that held them to the dock creaking in the same unhurried rhythm, a sound like a rocking chair on an old veranda, like the breathing of something enormous and at ease. Above the docks, lanterns hung from wooden crossbeams and from the eaves of the small warehouses and repair sheds that lined the waterfront. They were oil lanterns for the most part, and in the rain their light seemed softer than usual, diffused by the moisture in the air, so that each flame cast a gentle halo rather than a sharp beam. The light caught the raindrops as they fell and turned them briefly golden before they struck the water below and vanished. The surface of the harbor was covered in these tiny, overlapping circles, each one appearing and dissolving in the same instant, and if you watched long enough the whole harbor seemed to breathe, to expand and contract in some rhythm too slow and too large to fully perceive, but present nonetheless, the way the breathing of a sleeping person is present in a room even when you cannot hear it. The smell of the place was layered and familiar. Salt, always. The particular sharpness of the sea that clung to everything within a mile of the water, that you stopped noticing after a time the way you stopped noticing the smell of your own house, and then noticed again freshly when you had been away and returned. Beneath that, the smell of wetwood, of timber that had absorbed decades of rain and spray and was now releasing it slowly back into the air, a dark and intimate smell, the smell of something that has been given to and is giving back. And beneath that, something warmer still, the ghost of fish and cooking oil and wood smoke, the accumulated scent of meals prepared and eaten over many years in the small kitchens of the houses that backed up against the waterfront, the smell of lives lived close together in a place that had not changed very much in a very long time and had no particular wish to. It was into this that Arman woke. He did not use a clock. He had never needed one. His body knew the hour the way his hands knew the weight of a net, through long repetition, through a kind of intelligence that had nothing to do with thought. He opened his eyes in the darkness of his room, lay still for a moment listening to the rain on the roof above him, and then rose without ceremony, moving through the familiar darkness with the ease of a man who has made this same journey 1,000 times before and has long since memorized every variation in the floor, every place where the boards spoke under his weight, every distance between one piece of furniture and the next. The house was modest even by the standards of the village, a single-story structure of timber and plaster, with a shallow pitched roof and a narrow covered porch that faced the lane. It had belonged to his father before him and to his father's father before that, and its age showed in the gentle way the floorboards yielded underfoot, in the way the doors sat slightly off true in their frames, in the quality of the silence inside, which was the silence of a place that had known many long nights and had grown comfortable with them. It was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of accumulation, of years and seasons and the small sounds of daily life that had seeped into the walls and the wood and become part of the texture of the place, so that even when nothing was happening, it did not feel like nothing. Arman moved through the small front room, past the low table where the evening's dishes had been stacked and washed and left to dry, past the shelf where a framed verse from the Quran hung slightly crooked and he straightened it each morning without thinking, to the doorway of his father's room. He paused here. Listened. The sound of his father's breathing came to him slow and even, a little labored in the way it had been for the past several months, the chest working harder than it once had, but steady. Steady was what mattered. Arman let his own breath out slowly and did not enter the room. His father, Rahim, slept best in the early hours, and the kindest thing Arman could do was leave that sleep undisturbed for as long as possible. He had learned this about caring for someone, that much of it was not action but restraint. Not doing the thing you wanted to do, which was to go in, to check, to be present and reassure yourself that everything was still all right. Waiting, instead. Trusting the sound of the breathing. Letting the sleep be what it was. He went to the kitchen instead. He filled the kettle from the clay water jar kept beside the stove and set it on the burner, then stood in the warm glow of the single kitchen light, a bare bulb that gave off a yellowed, domestic warmth, and listened to the rain while the water heated. There was no urgency in this. The kettle would take as long as it took. The rain would fall as long as it fell. The morning was unfolding according to its own unhurried logic, and he was simply moving through it. Rahim had been a fisherman once, and a good one. Arman had grown up watching his father read the sea the way other men read pages, naturally, fluently, with an ease that looked like gift but was the product of patience and long attention. It had been Rahim who taught him how to mend a net so the repair was stronger than the original weave. It had been Rahim who taught him to feel the shape of a school of fish through the resistance of a line, to judge the weather by the color of the horizon at dusk, to speak to a nervous boat as though it were a living thing, because in all the ways that mattered, it was. A boat had memory in it, his father used to say. It remembered every sea it had crossed and every hand that had held its tiller, and if you paid attention, it told you things. The illness had come slowly, as these things often do. A shortness of breath at first, easy to attribute to age, to the heat, to any number of things that were not what it was. Then a tiredness that grew heavier by degrees, not the tiredness of work, which has its own satisfaction, but the tiredness of the body pulling inward, conserving, as though it were making calculations about what it could and could not sustain. Then the cough. Now Rahim spent most of his hours in his room or on the porch, a thin blanket across his knees even on the warmer days, watching the lane and the trees and the changing light with the equanimity of a man who has made his peace with stillness. He did not complain. He had never been a man who complained. He asked only for company, and for his tea, and occasionally for the small radio to be brought in from the front room so he could listen to the recitations in the evening. Arman made the tea carefully. Loose leaves in the small pot, water at the right temperature, not quite boiling, just off the boil, the way his father had always insisted, a patience in the steeping that he had learned from watching his father and had kept long after the learning was necessary because it had become, by then, simply the way he made tea. He poured a cup, covered the pot with its woven cozy to keep the rest warm for when Rahim woke, and then took his own cup and stood at the back door, looking out at the small yard where the rain was falling steadily through the darkness. A coconut palm stood at the yard's edge. In the rain, its long fronds moved in a slow, graceful arc, each one catching water along its length and releasing it in a silver curtain to the leaves below, and then to the earth. The ground beneath the palm was dark and soft. Somewhere in the hibiscus hedge that ran along the low fence, a small frog was calling, a single clear note, repeated at intervals, patient and unhurried, as though it had found the one sentence it wished to say and was content to say it over and over for as long as the rain lasted. Arman drank his tea. The warmth of it moved through him like a tide coming in. There was work to do. There was always work to do. But for this small space of time, in the dark and the rain, before the day had properly begun, he allowed himself simply to stand and to listen. These were the minutes he valued most, if he had been asked to say so, which no one ever did, because Arman was not a man whose inner life prompted many questions from the people around him. He was too steady, perhaps. Too apparently at ease with himself. People asked questions of those who seemed troubled. Arman did not seem troubled. He was simply quiet, and in his quietness there was a depth that went largely unexamined, the way certain rooms in familiar houses go largely unvisited, not because there is anything wrong with them but simply because daily life finds its way into other rooms. He was 29 years old in the way that some men are that age and already know the shape of their lives. He knew the sea. He knew his father. He knew the lanes of the village and the names of the boats and the habits of the tides. He knew how to be useful, to his father, to his neighbors, to anyone who came to him with something broken or something heavy. He was the person people thought of when a roof needed patching before the rain got heavier, when a net needed a repair that was beyond their own skill, when a boat had developed a noise that needed someone who understood boats to diagnose. He did not mind being useful. He had not chosen it as an identity so much as simply found himself, again and again, in situations where a steady hand and a quiet presence made a difference, and he had found that making a difference was not a small thing. What he did not have, what he had not yet found, was someone to sit beside in the evenings. Someone to share the quiet with, rather than filling it alone. He did not speak of this want, even to himself, very directly. But it was there the way certain things are there, acknowledged in the peripheral vision of the heart, never quite looked at directly, but present. Present the way the sound of the rain was present in the house, even in the rooms where you could not quite hear it, felt rather than heard, known rather than seen, a fact of the place that did not require your attention to remain true. He rinsed his cup, set it on the rack, went to find his rain gear. The net shed was a short walk from the house, along a narrow lane that ran between the backs of the waterfront buildings. In the rain, the lane smelled of wet earth and old wood, and the lantern at the lane's end cast a trembling orange light across the puddles that had formed in the low spots between the stones. Arman walked through all of this with his head slightly bowed against the rain, his footsteps steady, his breath easy. He passed the back wall of his neighbor Pac Darris's house, where a single light burned in a high window. The old man was an even earlier riser than Arman, though his morning preparations were confined these days mostly to the kitchen and the porch, his seagoing days behind him. The net shed held his equipment, the long-handled tools for deep water work, the wooden floats strung on lengths of cord, the neatly coiled ropes of varying thicknesses, and the nets themselves, hung on wooden pegs and frames in careful order. He moved among them in the lamplight, checking each piece with his hands, feeling for damage, for weakness, for the beginning of a tear that wanted attending to before it became something worse. His hands were large and calloused and very capable, and they moved through the nets with a sureness that was almost gentle, the way you might run your hands through the hair of someone you loved, attentive, thorough, unhurried. He found a small breach in the third net, not yet a tear, just a loosening of the weave at a pressure point, the kind of thing that could be missed if you were in a hurry, the kind of thing that would fail at the worst moment if it was not tended to. He set it aside to mend before he left, threaded his needle with the familiar motion, and worked in the lamplight while the rain drummed steadily on the tin roof above him. The needle moved through the weave with a rhythm that was its own kind of meditation. In, out, in, over, under. Each stitch placed with the same deliberateness as the last, each one building on the one before, the repair accumulating the way all patient work accumulates, slowly, visibly, one small action at a time. He had learned to mend nets before he learned to read. His hands knew this work the way they knew the tiller, the way they knew the weight of his father's arm when Raheem needed steadying on the steps. The body holds what it has been asked to learn, and holds it longer than the mind holds almost anything else. Mending was one of those tasks that required just enough attention to be restful. The hands worked, the eyes watched the emerging repair, and the mind was left largely free to drift. Arman's mind did not drift dramatically. It moved the way water moves in a quiet place, in slow, easy circles, returning again and again to the same familiar points. The state of his father's breathing this morning. The weather and what it suggested about the conditions at the reef. The boat, his father's boat, now his, and whether the caulking on the starboard side had held through the last heavy rain or whether it would need attention before the week was out. He finished the mend, held it to the light, ran his thumb across the repaired section. Firm. Clean. It would hold. He hung the net back on its peg and stood for a moment in the shed, listening to the rain on the roof and the occasional creak of the dock timbers as the water moved beneath them. The shed smelled of rope and salt and the particular drywood smell that old buildings accumulate over decades of being used for the same purpose, a smell entirely specific to this shed, to this work, and that Arman had known since before he had words for it. When he was very young, his father used to bring him here in the early mornings, and Arman would sit on an upturned bucket and watch Rahim work, not understanding most of what he was seeing but absorbing it nonetheless, the posture, the patience, the quality of attention that the work demanded and received. He had thought, sitting there as a small child, that his father was the most capable person in the world. He still thought something like that. The word he would have used had changed, but what it pointed at had not. Outside, the rain was easing slightly, the sharp intensity of the early morning fall softening to something more contemplative, a sound like distant applause or like someone turning pages in a quiet room. The sky had not yet begun to lighten, but there was something in the quality of the darkness that suggested light was somewhere in the conversation, not imminent, but no longer entirely absent. He carried the nets to the boat in 2 trips, moving carefully along the wet dock, each plank familiar beneath his feet, each variation in the surface known to his body without having to be thought about. The boat rocked as he stepped aboard and settled as he moved to its center, a small, automatic courtesy of balance that he performed without thinking. He laid the nets in their proper place, checked the fuel, checked the bilge, ran his hand along the gunwale on the starboard side and felt the caulking. It had held. Good. He sat for a moment in the stern of the boat, in the slowly diminishing rain, and looked out across the harbor. The other boats were still moored. Here and there a light moved at the far end of the dock, another fisherman beginning his own preparations, but mostly the harbor was still, the lanterns burning, the water rocking the boats in its patient, continuous way. From somewhere on the far side of the water came the sound of a rooster announcing the day, which was not yet quite here but was unmistakably coming. The sound of it traveled across the water and the still air with the clarity that sounds have in the early morning, before the day fills up with its own noise. Arman watched a heron land on one of the dock pilings across the way, a large, gray shape that folded itself down out of the dark air and became perfectly still the moment it landed, as though it had always been there, as though stillness were its natural state and the flight had been the interruption. It stood and regarded the water with the absolute concentration of a creature that has only one purpose in any given moment and is fully equal to it. He had always admired herons for this. Their patience was not the patience of waiting for something to happen. It was the patience of being entirely present in the thing itself, in the standing, in the watching, in the particular quality of attention that makes the difference between seeing and truly seeing. He watched it for a while. Then he started the engine. The motor turned over with the familiar sound that was the sound of all his mornings, a roughness at first, then a smoothing out, a settling into its own rhythm, the low vibration of it moving up through the hull and into the soles of his feet. He let it warm. The smell of exhaust mixed with the smell of rain and salt and became something that was simply the smell of going out. He cast off the mooring lines, bow then stern, coiled them neatly out of the way, and eased the throttle forward. The boat moved out of its berth slowly, carefully, the way one moves through a room where others are sleeping. The harbor water was dark and very smooth this morning, the rain having quieted the surface so that the reflections of the lanterns lay in long, undulating columns from the docks to the open water. The heron watched him pass and did not move. At the harbor mouth, where the protected water met the open sea, there was a change in the texture of things. The swells were gentle this morning, long and low, the kind that the boat rose over without effort and descended again without drama. The rain had thinned further, and somewhere ahead of him, in the direction of the horizon, the darkness had the faintest suggestion of a new quality, still dark, but a dark that was thinking about something. Arman opened the throttle slightly. The boat lifted at the bow and began to find its pace. The sea spread out around him, gray and broad and full of its own life, indifferent and welcoming at once. He knew this water. He had known it since he was a boy sitting at the bow of this same boat while his father stood at the stern, learning to read the surface, learning to feel the currents, learning that the sea was not a setting but a presence, complex and responsive and deserving of respect. That respect was not fear, his father had been clear about that. It was the particular attention you gave to something that had its own rules and did not bend them for you, the same attention you gave to a skilled elder, to a craft that required years to understand. You did not conquer the sea. You came to know it. And knowing it, you moved through it carefully, and it allowed you passage, and that was the agreement. He had learned all of that. And he went out into it each morning the way people go to the things they love, with something close to gratitude, even on the ordinary days, even on the days when the catch was poor and the rain was heavy and his back ached and his father had not slept well. Even on those days, the going out was still the going out, and that was something. Behind him, the lights of the harbor grew smaller. Ahead, the sea opened up into the dark morning, the rain falling softly now, barely more than a mist, settling on the water so gently it was almost impossible to tell where the sea ended and the rain began. The village was waking, though he would not be there to see it. The lanes would be filling with the smell of breakfast, rice and sambal, the scent of coffee, the sound of children being called and responding and not responding and being called again. The market would be opening, the vendors arranging their goods in the soft gray light, the first buyers arriving with their baskets and their quiet morning purpose. His father would wake soon, would find the tea kept warm under its cozy, would sit in his chair and listen to the rain on the roof, and he would be all right. He was always all right in the mornings. The mornings were his easiest hours. Arman would be back before noon. He always was. He settled into the motion of the boat, the steady rising and falling, the rhythm of the engine beneath him, the mist of rain cool on his face and his forearms where his sleeves were rolled back. He checked the compass from long habit, though he barely needed it. He knew the direction to the reef the way he knew the direction home. The sky ahead of him began, very slowly, to separate from the sea. A line of lighter gray appeared at the horizon, not a sunrise yet, nothing so definitive. Just the first tentative distinction between water and air, between night and what came after. It was a sight he had seen hundreds of times and it still held him, briefly, in a particular kind of silence. The silence of witnessing. The silence of being the only person, at this precise moment, looking at this precise thing from this precise place. He watched it come. He breathed. The boat moved forward into the opening of the day. The reef was perhaps 20 minutes out at this pace, and he knew every minute of the journey, the particular texture of the water as it deepened, the way the color of it changed from the greenish-brown of the harbor shallows to the clear, darker blue of open water, the moment when the bottom dropped away and was no longer visible and you were simply moving across the surface of something very deep and very old. He had made this crossing so many times that his body did it independently of his thoughts, managing the throttle and the tiller with the same unconscious competence with which he straightened the picture frame on the shelf, a habit so ingrained it had long since ceased to feel like a choice. The mist was lifting now, or rather the light was beginning to gather enough that the mist was visible as mist rather than simply as the quality of the dark. He could see the surface of the water more clearly, its texture, the way each swell caught the earliest gray of the morning on its windward slope and held a trace of shadow on its lee. There were birds out here, moving low over the water in long, unhurried arcs, the kind of birds that spend their lives at sea and come to shore only when they must. He watched them and they did not watch him, going about the specific business of their morning with a concentration that left no room for anything that was not the water and the fish and the wind. He thought of his father, briefly, as he sometimes did out here in the early morning. Not with worry, the worry was a thing he kept for the shore, for the walk to the boat and the walk back, but with a softer kind of attention, the way you think of someone whose company you carry with you. Raheem had taught him to love this hour. Had been the one, all those years ago, to show him that the sea before dawn was not a dark and uncertain thing to be endured until the light arrived, but something entire in itself, something that asked only patience and received it. And the rain, which had been his companion since before the stars went in, fell on. Chapter 2. The Market by the Sea. He returned to the harbor as the morning was fully arriving. The catch had been modest, a good basket of mackerel, a handful of larger fish whose silver sides caught the light as they shifted in the hull, a scattering of smaller things that would be sorted and sold by the pound at the market stall he kept with his neighbor, old Pac Darris, who handled the selling while Arman handled the sea. It was an arrangement they had fallen into years ago without ever formally agreeing to it, which was the way the best arrangements often came about, not through discussion but through the gradual revelation of what suited each person, through the small adjustments made over time until the fit was right. He moored the boat with practiced ease, secured the lines, and began the work of unloading. The dock was busy now in the way it was always busy by mid-morning, other fishermen returning, boys helping carry baskets and ice, the smell of brine and engine oil sharp in the warming air. Someone called to him from 2 boats down. He raised a hand in answer without looking up. The language of the dock was full of gestures. You learned it early and it stayed with you. By the time he had cleaned the boat and delivered the catch to Pac Darris at the market stall, the sun had climbed high enough that the rain of the morning felt like something from another day. The sky was a soft, washed white, clouds moving slowly overhead, and between them, patches of blue that were very clear and very far away. The air was humid still, heavy with moisture that had not yet decided whether to fall again or simply hang in the heat and wait. Everything smelled clean and slightly green, the way the world smells after rain, when the earth has received what it needed and is still in the first moments of that receiving. The market was laid out along the waterfront road, a long, informal procession of stalls and tables and awnings that had grown up over many years into something that felt as permanent as the buildings on either side of it, though nothing about it was fixed. It moved slightly each season, contracted and expanded according to who had come and who had gone, which families had sent a daughter or son away to the city and which had returned with a new trade or a new person attached to them. It was a living thing, the market, in the way that all places are living things when they are genuinely used and genuinely needed. The sounds of it, this morning, were the sounds he had known all his life. The voices of vendors calling to early customers in the casual abbreviated language of commercial familiarity. The knock and slide of ice being shifted in its containers. The particular sound of fish being laid out on wet surfaces, a soft, flat sound, definitive and brief. Somewhere a child was laughing at something. Somewhere an old man was arguing about a price with the pleasure of someone who values the argument more than the outcome. All of it overlapping, all of it rising and falling in a way that was not chaos but rhythm, the rhythm of a place doing what it existed to do, which was to bring people together around the things they needed, and let the being together be its own additional thing. This morning, as he walked the market's length toward the far end where the ice vendor kept his station, Arman was aware of it with the half-attention of a man who has walked the same route many times and notices change the way you notice when a piece of furniture has been moved, not consciously, not immediately, but as a small disturbance in the expected shape of things. The disturbance, when he finally identified it, was a stall near the middle of the market that he had not seen before. Or rather, a stall that had been there before, occupied for as long as he could remember by an elderly man who sold dried prawns and preserved fish, but which was now occupied by someone else entirely. She was arranging her goods with great care, laying out fish on beds of crushed ice with a precision that suggested she was thinking about how each piece looked, not just how many pieces she could fit. The display had a quality of deliberateness to it, the larger fish at the back, the smaller ones fanned in neat rows toward the front, a bunch of fresh pandan leaves tucked at one corner that were not strictly necessary but made the whole arrangement smell clean and green and alive. She had a canvas awning in faded yellow, and beneath it she moved with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had learned her work well and trusted it. She was young, perhaps a year or two younger than him. Her hair was dark and pulled back, and she wore a light blouse the color of unbleached cotton. Her hands, he noticed, were the hands of someone who worked with them constantly, capable, careful, quick. There was a quality of focused absorption about her, the way a person looks when they are doing something they know how to do and are doing it to the best of their ability, which is a quality that is recognizable across any language or distance. He might have walked past without incident. He usually did. What happened instead was that he had not quite adjusted his course from the habit of walking the route as he had always walked it, and the stall was placed slightly further into the lane than the dried prawn man had kept his, and his shoulder caught the edge of her display table at the precise moment that she had set a shallow tray of fish across its corner. The tray went over. He caught most of it, reflexes built by years of moving on a boat in rough water, of catching things before they hit, of making adjustments in the fraction of a second before the adjustment became too late. He caught the tray itself and two of the larger fish and went to one knee in the process, which meant the smaller fish were already on the ground by the time he had steadied everything else. For a moment the two of them were very still, he kneeling on the wet ground with the tray in his hands, she with both arms extended toward where the tray had been, both of them regarding the mackerel scattered across the lane with the slightly stunned expression of people assessing the exact scale of a small disaster. He began to gather the fish. She bent at the same moment. Their hands met over the same fish, a medium-sized mackerel that lay crossways between them, and both of them pulled back at the same instant, and then reached again at the same instant, and then there was a brief, suspended moment in which neither of them moved at all. He looked up. She looked up. Her eyes were very steady. Dark brown, and direct without being sharp, the kind of directness that comes not from aggression but from honesty, from a person who has decided that the simplest approach to most situations is to simply look clearly at what is in front of them. He said, in Malay, that he was very sorry. She said, also in Malay, with an accent he did not immediately recognize, something slightly different in the rhythm of it, in the way certain vowels opened a fraction wider than he was used to, that it was all right. These things happened. Please do not worry about the fish. They gathered the fish together. He stood and she stood, and he handed her the tray, and she accepted it, and then they both looked at it for a moment as though confirming that the crisis had passed. He asked where she had come from. It was not, in the market, an unusual question. She told him. The Philippines, a coastal town not so very different from this one, she said, though the sea had a different color there and the fish had different names. She had come here some months ago, she said. She had a cousin here who had married a local man, and through that connection she had found her footing, found her stall, found her way into the rhythms of this place. She said it simply, without asking for anything from it. Not for sympathy at the strangeness of being far from home, not for admiration at the practicality of her choices. She said it the way people state facts when they have made their peace with those facts, as information, offered without particular weight. And yet there was something in the saying of it, in the quality of steadiness with which she said it, that told him something about the kind of person she was. That she had arrived here with difficulty and had not made the difficulty the central fact of her presence. He told her his name. She told him hers. Maya. He said it back to her once, quietly, in the way you repeat a word when you want to hear how it sounds in your own voice. She smiled at that, not a performance of a smile, just the small, real version that happens when something lands gently in the right place. Then she turned back to her display and began rearranging the fish that had been displaced, working with the same deliberate care he had noticed before. He watched her for a moment longer than was quite comfortable. Then he said he hoped business went well, and he meant it, and she thanked him, and he continued down the lane toward the ice vendor. He was halfway there before he noticed that he was still thinking about her eyes. The way they had been direct without being demanding. The way she had said it was all right about the fish and had clearly meant it. There was no performance in her, he thought. No arrangement of herself for the benefit of observers. She had simply been exactly what she was, in the way that some people manage and many others do not. He bought the ice. He helped Pack Darris carry it back to the stall. He sorted the morning's catch for the last time and gave Pack Darris the tally and left the old man to his selling. Walking home, he passed her stall again. She was serving a customer, a woman with a basket who was pointing at different fish and listening as Maya explained something, probably about freshness, about how to prepare them, speaking with the manner of someone who finds the subject genuinely interesting and does not particularly mind sharing what she knows. The customer laughed at something she said. Maya laughed too, a real laugh, brief and unguarded, the kind that happens when something is actually funny rather than when you decide it should be. Arman walked on. The clouds had thickened again by the time he reached home, and as he came through the door he could hear, just beginning, the tentative tapping of the first returning drops on the roof, the rain remembering itself, settling back into the rhythm it had held since before dawn. It fell on the lane and on the banana leaves and on the harbor and on the boats and on the canvas awnings of the market stalls. And on the yellow awning of the stall near the middle of the row, where Maya stood arranging her fish on their beds of ice, steady and deliberate and entirely at home in her own capable hands. He went to check on his father. Rahim was awake, sitting in his chair with the thin blanket across his knees and the small radio turned low on the table beside him. The recitation coming from it was very soft, barely more than breath. He looked up when Arman came in, and something in his face eased, not worry releasing, exactly, but the particular quiet pleasure of a man who simply likes to see his son. Arman pulled up the low stool and sat beside him. He told his father about the catch. He told him about the weather at the reef, the long, easy swells, the morning light coming up behind the clouds. He did not mention the market, or the overturned tray, or the woman with the direct eyes and the yellow awning. But he thought about her, at the edge of his mind, the way the rain was always there at the edge of hearing on mornings like this, present, continuous, easy to overlook, impossible to entirely forget. His father listened and asked a question or two and then grew quiet in the comfortable way of a man who is content simply to have company. The rain came down steadily outside. Inside the room it was warm and dim, and the smell of tea was still in the air from the morning, and the recitation murmured from the small radio, very low, like a river heard from a distance. The afternoon settled in around them both, unhurried and whole. Outside, the rain had steadied into the particular rhythm that meant it was in for the evening, not the sharp insistent rain of a passing shower but the long, even, committed rain of a sky that has decided on a thing and will not be hurried out of it. Arman was glad of it, in the way he was usually glad when the rain settled in like this. It made the world smaller in the best sense, contracted the horizon, muffled the sounds of the lane, turned the house into something enclosed and complete, a place apart from the larger world and its demands. He made a second pot of tea, brought his father a cup and took his own and sat in the chair he kept near the window, the one that let him see the lane without being seen clearly from it. The lane was empty now, the rain having persuaded everyone indoors. The banana trees at the neighbor's fence were bowing deeply with each gust, releasing their collected water in long silver streams, then straightening slowly, and bowing again. It was a movement he had watched from this window his whole life, and it had the quality of all long familiar things, present without demanding, available without imposing. His father's eyes had closed. The radio murmured on. Arman did not turn it off. He sat with his tea and let the afternoon do what it was doing and did not try to direct it anywhere in particular. The afternoon settled in around them both, unhurried and whole. Chapter 3. The Ghost Net and the Silver Rescue. The storm came in from the south, the way the worst ones usually did. Arman had seen it building for 2 days before it arrived, the particular quality of the light in the afternoons, a yellowish heaviness that sat on the water like something physical, the way the birds moved in the hours before dark, cutting their patterns shorter, staying closer to the shore. He had felt it in the pressure behind his eyes on the second morning, which was a sensation he had known since adolescence and had learned to trust completely. The sea had its own language for what was coming, and if you had spent enough years paying attention, You learn to read it the way you read your own body, without quite knowing how you knew, only that you did. He had done what he always did when a storm was coming. He had run through his preparations the evening before in the calm, systematic way his father had taught him, checking every mooring line, every cleat, every piece of equipment that might be caught by wind or loosened by water. He had moved his boat to the more sheltered berth at the inner curve of the harbor, where the dock's angle gave protection from the south, and he had stayed up into the night to check the lines again after the first heavy gusts came through. By the time the full storm arrived, in the gray and churning hours before dawn, he was as ready as readiness allowed. It lasted 2 days. The harbor turned the color of pewter, then of dark iron. Rain came not in drops but in a continuous gray mass, the kind of rain that has no space between its parts, that falls like a moving wall and turns the air to water so that the distinction between sea and sky becomes largely theoretical. The boats strained at their moorings. The docks were empty of everyone who did not absolutely need to be on them. The lanes of the village ran ankle-deep and the gutters roared. Arman spent the storm hours at home or at the harbor, alternating. He checked the boat. He checked the lines. He came home and sat with his father, who slept more heavily in storm weather, something about the pressure, or the darkness, or simply the body's recognition that there was nothing to be done but wait. He cooked. He mended another section of net by lamplight while the wind pressed against the shutters and the rain on the roof was so loud it was almost not a sound anymore, just a presence, a physical thing you existed inside. He thought, in a brief and peripheral way, about Maya's stall, about whether the yellow awning was strong enough for the wind, and then put the thought away because there was nothing he could do about it, and thinking about things you cannot do anything about is a particular kind of waste. The storm gave him time, in the way that bad weather always gives fishermen time, not chosen time, not the time you would have arranged for yourself, but time nonetheless. He used it the way he used all such time, by doing what was in front of him, one thing after the next, without reaching ahead of his own hands. He oiled the engine parts he had been meaning to oil for a month. He replaced the fraying cord on the anchor line. He read, briefly, from the small collection of books that lived on the shelf beside the Quran, a battered history of the region's sea trade that he had owned since his father gave it to him years ago and that he returned to periodically, always finding something he had not noticed on the previous reading. He made meals and ate them and washed the dishes and put them away. He slept, a little, in the afternoon of the first day, which was a thing he rarely did and which the storm seemed to have given him permission for. On the second afternoon, the storm began to release its grip. Not dramatically. The sea does not apologize for its storms by immediately restoring calm. What happened was more gradual than that, a lessening by degrees. The rain thinned from wall to curtain to veil. The wind dropped from a sustained howl to an intermittent complaint to an occasional reminder. The water in the harbor was still churned and dark, the swells still heavy and irregular, but the worst of it had passed and the particular quality of the light, even through the remaining cloud cover, had changed from the pressed-down heaviness of deep storm to something with more air in it, something that suggested the sky was once again a sky rather than a ceiling. Arman went out. He knew he should wait. Any experienced fisherman knows you should wait after a storm, for the sea to settle, for the debris to clear, for conditions to return to something your boat can manage without being asked to do more than it was built for. He knew all of this. He also knew the reef the way he knew his own house in the dark, knew its landmarks and its moods and its particular traps, and something, he could not have named it, could only have said it was a feeling, an insistence that did not have language, was pulling him out toward it. He went slowly. The boat moved carefully through the still disrupted water, picking its way around the floating debris that every storm leaves behind, pieces of wood, a broken float, a swath of tangled weed ripped from the seafloor and deposited on the surface like a careless afterthought. The sky was low and the color of old pewter, and the sea beneath it was a deep, churning indigo that moved with long, uneasy swells, still carrying the storm's energy in its body even as the storm itself dissolved overhead. He reached the outer reef and caught the engine to idle, letting the boat drift while he looked. The water here was deeper than at the inner reef, and darker for it. He could see the coral formations below as shapes rather than colors, masses of gray and black shifting with the movement of the water overhead, schools of smaller fish catching the dim light in brief, collective flashes. Everything was slightly out of its usual place, the way a room looks after it has been searched, the furniture still there, but rearranged by something that did not know or care about the original order. He almost missed it. What he saw first was a disturbance in the water near the reef's edge, a thrashing, irregular, too sharp and too purposeful to be the movement of the swell alone. He cut the engine entirely and let the boat drift closer, standing at the bow with one hand on the gunwale to steady himself against the movement of the hull. It was a dolphin. Young, he thought, not fully grown, its body slender and its movements not yet possessing the economy of a mature animal. It was turning in the water with a frantic, exhausting energy, and as he drifted closer he could see why. A ghost net, one of the abandoned drift nets that fishermen left when they could not retrieve them, which then continued to move through the water catching everything that came near, had wrapped around the animal in several places. One length of filament had caught around its dorsal fin. Another had wound around its tail flukes, restricting the powerful stroke that a dolphin needs to breathe, to rise, to live. He read the situation quickly and without panic. This was the thing about crises that were solvable, they required not emotion but clarity. He assessed what he could see of the net, the angles of it, the places where it was tight and the places where it might be worked loose, and he went to his equipment and took out his net knife, the short, sharp blade he kept for exactly the kind of task that required cutting through filament quickly and precisely without cutting what you did not want to cut. He lowered himself over the side of the boat. The water hit him like a decision made. Cold, still churned from the storm, dark with suspended sediment. He kept one hand on the hull and moved carefully along the side of the boat toward the dolphin, which was close now, within arm's reach, still struggling, though the struggling had grown less violent in the past few moments, whether from exhaustion or from some instinct that recognized the approach of something that was not a threat. He began to speak. He did not think about it. It was simply what happened, a low, continuous murmur, barely above a whisper, the kind of sound you might make to a frightened child or a nervous animal, words that were less about meaning than about tone, about the particular vibration of a calm voice in a calm chest. He told the dolphin in a low hum that he was here, that it was going to be all right, that he needed it to be still for just a moment, just a little moment, he was going to help. He kept his movements slow and deliberate, each one telegraphed before he made it, giving the animal time to register what was happening and decide whether to tolerate it. Whether the dolphin understood the words is not the question. What it seemed to understand was the quality behind them, The lack of urgency, the steadiness, the absence of anything that needed to be feared. It continued to move, but its movements became less frantic, less total. It was, in its own animal way, listening. He worked with the knife. The filament of a ghost net is thin and strong and has no regard for what it catches. He could feel it resisting even the sharpest edge of the blade, and he worked with the patience that the situation demanded, which was complete patience, because impatience here would mean a slip, and a slip here would mean harm rather than help. He cut the first length from around the tail flukes with 3 careful strokes, feeling the tension release as the last strand parted. The tail moved, a single, powerful test stroke, and then stilled again as though the dolphin understood that the work was not finished. The length around the dorsal fin was more complicated. The net had wound itself tight in the storm, tighter than it would have been in calmer water, and he had to work the blade into a very small space with very careful control. His arm ached with the cold and the effort of holding himself steady against the movement of the water. He murmured without stopping. Cut. Work the blade to a better angle. Cut again. The last strand parted. For a moment, the dolphin hung in the water beside him, just below the surface, suspended in what he could only describe as stillness, a complete, absolute stillness, the kind that follows the end of a long effort. He could see its eye, large and dark and very close to his own, regarding him with an attention that had no name in any language he knew but was unmistakable. Then it moved. Not away. Not immediately. Instead it circled, a wide, slow circle around the boat, just below the surface, its movement now completely different from the desperate thrashing of before. Fluid. Purposeful. The movement of an animal that is fully itself again, fully restored to its own capability. He watched it from the water, holding the whole, the cold forgotten for the moment. It completed the circle and surfaced near the bow. A single exhalation, the sharp, clear sound of a dolphin breathing, a sound like something being freed, and then it was at the surface again, very close, clicking softly in that complex and private language that its kind have always had and that no human has ever fully decoded, though people have spent lifetimes trying. Arman climbed back into the boat. He was cold through to the bone and his arm ached from shoulder to wrist and he was wet in the particular way that takes hours to fully warm back from. None of this felt like anything worth thinking about. He sat in the stern and watched the dolphin. It stayed near the boat for some time, surfacing, breathing, diving in shallow arcs that brought it back to the surface within 20 or 30 meters, always returning to the same general proximity to the hole. It was not performing, he thought. It was simply not leaving. The distinction felt important, though he could not have explained why. Eventually, as the last gray light of the afternoon began to flatten toward evening, it dove and did not surface again in the place it had been. He watched the water for a long time after. The indigo had deepened toward black. The sky overhead had the first faint suggestion of stars visible between the dissolving clouds. He started the engine. He was halfway back to the harbor before he realized he was smiling. Not broadly, not the kind of smile that requires you to be aware of it. Just the small, private version that happens when something in the world has gone unexpectedly right, when you have been present at a moment of restoration, when the outcome was the good one and not the other. He had done what needed to be done. The dolphin was free. He sat in the boat for a long time after, longer than he needed to, longer than was strictly sensible given the cold and the failing light. But there was something about the quality of the silence out here, after what had happened, that he did not want to leave prematurely. The storm had passed. The sea was settling. The surface of the water, which had been so churned and violent for 2 days, was beginning to find its way back to something smoother, a process that was gradual and patient and could not be hurried. You could see it happening, the swells still long and uneven, but the sharp chop that sits on top of them in rough weather was quieting, flattening, the water returning to itself. He thought about what it meant, what he had just done. Not in a way that asked for significance, not in a way that required the moment to be more than it was. He had seen an animal in trouble and he had done what his hands knew how to do. That was all. And yet, there was something in the eye of the dolphin, in that last long look before it circled and departed, that stayed with him. He had been seen, in that look. Not observed, seen. In the way that happens rarely between creatures of different kinds, when the barrier of species becomes briefly less important than the bare fact of two presences, each aware of the other, each recognizing something. The harbor lights appeared ahead of him, reflected in the calming water, and he brought the boat home through the evening in the dying wind and the rain that was now barely more than memory, just a fine cool mist that you felt on your face and your hands and the back of your neck like a benediction, like the sea's particular way of saying that today, this was enough, that today it had been enough. Chapter 4. The Gift of the Sea. The dolphin came back the next morning. Arman was still in the harbor, checking the bilge after the storm, when he heard the clicking, that particular complex sound, layered and precise, coming from the water just off the dock. He straightened and looked over the gunwale and there it was. The same animal, he was certain of it, though he could not have explained with perfect confidence how he knew. There was something in the way it held itself in the water, something in the angle of its approach, a quality of familiarity that was not quite like anything he had words for, but that he recognized the way you recognize a voice before you fully hear what it is saying. He crouched at the dock's edge. The dolphin surfaced a meter from him, hung there in the still morning water, and looked at him with the same dark, considered attention it had given him from the water the afternoon before. Then it dove, and the surface closed over it, and Arman waited, and 30 seconds later it surfaced again in the same place, as though checking that he was still there. He went back to his work. But he was aware of the dolphin throughout, a presence at the edge of the harbor, circling, diving, occasionally surfacing near the boat in that same companionable way, not demanding anything, not performing, simply there. It reminded him, in an oblique way, of the way his father used to sit in the net shed when Arman was young and learning, not instructing, not interfering, simply present, available, watching with a quality of attention that communicated something more than words would have. When he went out that morning, it followed. He noticed it first as a shadow beneath the water to his starboard side, keeping pace with the hull in the effortless way that dolphins always seem to move alongside boats, as though they are simply choosing to travel in the same direction and the boat's speed is something they are tolerating with mild amusement. He cut the engine to half throttle and watched. The dolphin moved ahead of him, then turned, then moved ahead again, and there was something in the pattern of it that seemed less like play and more like direction. He followed. What he found, in the deeper water to the northeast of the usual reef, was a school of fish so dense that the surface above them flickered with reflected movement, a silvery shimmer visible from 30 meters. He could not have said whether the dolphin had led him here intentionally or whether their paths had simply converged by coincidence. He could only say that when he lowered the nets and pulled them up 20 minutes later, they were heavier than any nets he had pulled in months. He named the dolphin then, though only to himself, in the way you name things that have become, by some process you did not plan, important to you. Lumi, he thought. He did not know exactly why. Only that it fit, that there was something in the animal's quality, the way the light moved on its skin when it surfaced, the way its presence had something luminous about it that the word wanted to describe. Lumi came back the day after that. And the day after that. Not every morning, sometimes Arman went out and the water was simply water, no shadow keeping pace beside the hole, no clicking from the harbor's edge. But often enough that the pattern of it settled into his days as a new kind of ordinary, the way all things that are at first remarkable eventually become part of the fabric of the expected if they are consistent enough and kind enough and do not ask for more than they give. On the mornings when Lumi came, the catch was almost always good. Not always spectacular, but good, reliably good, in the way that made the difference between a month that was comfortable and a month that was not. Arman did not speak of this to the other fishermen in terms that would invite questions he could not answer. He simply went where Lumi led when Lumi led somewhere, and did not go there when Lumi did not, and let the results be their own explanation. There were mornings when the dolphin seemed simply to want company rather than to lead anywhere. Mornings when Lumi swam alongside the boat at its own pace, surfacing and breathing in that steady rhythm, occasionally angling toward the hole and then away again, the way a companion walks close and then gives space and then comes close again without anything being required of either party. On these mornings the catch was what it was, average, sometimes poor, but Arman found he did not mind. There was something about the presence of the dolphin on these mornings that was its own compensation. A quality of companionship that did not translate easily into any of the words he had for companionship, because it was not the companionship of shared language or shared history or even shared intention. It was something simpler. Two creatures, moving through the same water on the same morning, each aware of the other. That was all. And yet it was not nothing. It was on a morning in the third week after the storm that Maya first came to the house. He had not asked her. He would not have thought to ask her. It was not the way things were done between people who had spoken to each other twice at a market stall, and he was not in any case a man who asked easily for things that were not strictly practical. What happened instead was that he had mentioned, in passing, in one of those brief conversations that had become a quiet habit of his mornings after the market delivery, that his father had not been eating well, that the illness had taken something from his appetite and that the things Rahim did manage to eat were becoming fewer by the week. Maya had listened to this with the complete attention she gave to most things, not visibly sympathetic in the way that is more about the observer's comfort than the observed's need, but simply present, simply listening, weighing what she heard. The following afternoon, she appeared at the door. She carried a clay pot covered with a cloth, and the smell that came with it preceded her into the doorway, a complex, deeply familiar smell, sharp with tamarind and green with something that was almost certainly kong, warm with the particular richness of bone broth that had been cooking for a long time. She explained that it was sinigang, a soup from home, the kind her mother made when anyone in the family was unwell, the kind that had a reputation in her experience of reaching people who had stopped being reached by plainer things. She said this straightforwardly, without elaboration, in the practical tone of a person delivering something useful and not requiring the delivery to be made into an occasion. Arman stepped back from the door to let her in. He watched her move through the front room and into the kitchen with a natural ease that was not presumption but something closer to purpose, the ease of a person who is competent in kitchens and does not think of them as other people's territory so much as spaces where a particular kind of care gets performed, and care has no very strong sense of boundary. She set the pot on the stove, removed the cloth, tasted from the ladle she had brought with her, added something small from a pouch in her basket, tasted again. She adjusted the heat without asking where the controls were, because the controls were where they always were, in any kitchen with a burner of this kind, and she simply knew. He went to tell his father. Rahim looked up when Arman described the visitor, described her with the careful neutrality of a man who is being watched by a perceptive parent and knows it, and something in the old man's expression shifted, settled, arranged itself into a gentle and entirely unconcealed interest. He asked if he might come to the front room. Arman helped him up, settled him in the chair near the window where the afternoon light came in at a low, warm angle. Brought the small table close. Maya brought the soup herself. She set it before Rahim with a consideration that had nothing performative about it, placed it where he could reach it easily, set the spoon at the right angle, made sure the cloth was handy in case the bowl was warm to the touch. Then she sat in the chair across from him and folded her hands in her lap and waited. Rahim tasted the soup. He was quiet for a moment. His eyes went to the middle distance, to something that was not in the room, and Arman, watching from the doorway, understood that his father had gone somewhere briefly, back to some memory that the taste had opened, some place or time that the combination of tamarind and bone and green vegetables had given him access to. When he came back, his eyes were slightly brighter than they had been. He told Maya that it was very good. He said it with a simplicity that made it mean more than the words alone. She smiled. The small, real version. After that, she came on Tuesdays and Fridays. She brought different things, sometimes the sinigang, sometimes a rice congee she made with ginger and spring onion that was gentle on a stomach that had grown uncertain about heavier food, sometimes a fish preparation from home that she called paksiu, where the fish was cooked slowly in vinegar and garlic until the flesh was soft and the broth was something you could dip rice into and find entirely satisfying. She came in the afternoon, when her stall was done, and she stayed for an hour or two, sitting with Rahim while Arman worked on whatever needed working on, a shutter that had come loose in a storm and needed rehanging, a section of the porch roof that had lifted and wanted renailing, the slow, meditative work of carving a new thole pin for the boat from a piece of hard timber he kept for exactly such purposes. She watched him work sometimes, from the porch, without commenting. It was not the watching of someone who needs to fill silence with observation. It was simply the comfortable watching of a person who finds it restful to see skilled work being done, the way you might watch a river or a fire, not because you need to understand it but because there is something in the quality of absorbed capability that is naturally calming to be near. He was aware of her watching. He did not mind it. He found, to his own mild surprise, that he worked better for it, more carefully, more patiently, as though the presence of someone paying quiet attention brought up the quality that was usually only available to him when he was entirely alone. One evening, after a Friday visit that had stretched later than usual, Rahim had been in good form, wanting to talk, telling stories of the sea that neither of them had heard exactly this version of before, the particular stories that illness sometimes unlocks in old men who begin to understand that their stories will need other people to carry them. Arman walked Maya back along the shore road. It was not planned. She had said something about the direction she was going and he had simply fallen into step beside her, and neither of them had remarked on it. The rain had stopped an hour before. The shore road was wet and the puddles on it reflected the sky, which was clearing from the west in long, pale bands of color. The tide was in, and the water came up close to the road's edge, and they walked in the smell of salt and wet earth and the particular clean freshness that follows rain when the air has been thoroughly washed and not yet refilled with the day's accumulated warmth. She told him about her town in the Philippines. About the quality of the sea there, which was bluer than this sea, she said, a different kind of blue, more transparent near the shore where the sand was white, though the deep water had its own darkness. She told him about her family there, her mother, who cooked the way some people breathe, without effort, without thinking about it, producing from very ordinary ingredients things that were quietly extraordinary. Her younger brother, who was studying in the city and sending home letters that were full of everything except what he actually felt, the way young men's letters often are. She did not tell him why she had left, exactly. He did not ask. He had learned, by this point in his life, that the reasons people leave places are complicated and usually involve more than one true thing at the same time, and that the truest way to hear them is to wait until the person decides to offer them, which they will do, if you are patient and do not press. He told her about his father's stories. About growing up on the water, about learning the sea the way other children learned a language, by immersion, by repetition, by the gradual, accumulated understanding that comes from spending enough time in any place to begin to hear what it is always trying to say. He told her about the early mornings, which had always been his favorite part of the day, and she said that hers too, that she liked the quality of the light before the heat arrived, the way the world felt briefly possible in a different way in those first hours, as though anything might still be decided, as though the day had not yet committed to being any particular thing. They stopped at a place where the road curved and the shoreline opened up, and you could see down the coast to where the lights of the next village made a low, warm cluster against the dark water. The wind off the sea was light and cool. Somewhere out in the water, a light moved, a fishing boat, very distant, making its way along the coast. They stood there for a while without speaking. The quiet between them had by this point become something different from the quiet of strangers. It had the comfortable texture of a quiet that does not need to be filled, that can simply exist between two people without requiring either of them to do anything about it. He walked her to the turning where her cousin's house was. They said good night in the simple way of people who know they will see each other again soon and do not feel the need to make a ceremony of parting. Walking home alone, he was aware of the particular quality that the evening had taken on, the wet road, the settling dark, the sound of the water on one side and the sound of the village on the other, and himself moving between them at his usual unhurried pace. He had walked this road 1,000 times. But it was different now, or perhaps he was different, and the difference was the kind that does not announce itself as a change so much as simply make itself known, gradually, as you go. He thought about what she had said about the mornings. That she liked the quality of the light before the heat arrived, the way the world felt briefly possible in a different way. He had felt that too, all his life, and had never heard anyone else describe it in quite those words, and the recognition of it, the finding of his own experience mirrored in someone else's, had the specific warmth that such recognitions always carry. The warmth of being less alone in a way you had not known you were. He went home and looked in on his father, who was asleep, his breathing slower and more even than it had been in weeks, one hand resting open on the blanket in the relaxed way of a man whose sleep is, for once, genuinely restful. Arman stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he went to bed, and the rain, which had been gathering itself offshore since evening, began again very softly on the roof above him, and he fell asleep to it before he had finished the thought he had been starting. Chapter 5. A home of quiet joy. The change in Rahim came slowly, the way all good changes come, not in a moment that could be pointed to afterward and named, but in a gradual accumulation of small things that you only recognized as a pattern once enough of them had gathered. His appetite returned first, cautiously, like an animal that has been frightened and approaches again only when it has had sufficient time to determine that the danger has passed. He began finishing the soups Maya brought. Then he began asking for seconds, which he had not done for anything in the better part of a year. Then one morning Arman came into the kitchen and found his father standing at the stove, attempting to make his own tea, which was the first time he had stood at the stove voluntarily in 4 months, and Arman said nothing about it, only got down the cups and stood nearby in case he was needed, and was not needed, and was glad. The cough did not disappear. They had not expected it to disappear. The illness was what it was, and Rahim was 65 years old, and the body at 65 does not return from these things the way it might at 30. But the cough became less a defining quality of his days and more something that happened several times and then was done, and in between, Rahim was more present than he had been, more engaged, more interested in what was happening in the lane outside, more likely to have a story he wanted to tell or a question he wanted to ask or a comment on the quality of the morning light that made it clear he was seeing it, really seeing it, rather than simply enduring it. He had taken greatly to Maya. This was apparent in the way he spoke to her when she came, with a warmth that was not his manner with strangers, that was not even entirely his manner with people he had known for years. It was the particular warmth of a man who recognizes in another person a quality he values deeply and does not see often enough, and who is old enough to have stopped pretending not to notice such things when they are in front of him. He asked her about her family. He listened to her answers with the complete, unhurried attention that had always been one of his finest qualities. He told her things about Arman's childhood that Arman had not thought about in years and would not have told her himself, and she listened to these with a kind of quiet delight that she did not entirely hide. In the evenings when she stayed, the three of them often sat on the porch together. Rahim in his chair with the blanket, Maya on the low bench she had come to think of as hers, Arman on the steps or leaning against the post, depending on his mood and the state of his back after the day. They talked, or they did not talk, according to whatever the evening seemed to want. The lane was quiet by that hour. The birds had settled. The smell of cooking from the neighboring houses drifted through the still air, and from somewhere down the lane the sound of a child being called in for the night, and the child's brief, formal protest, and then silence. These were the sounds of a place at rest. A place doing what it did every evening, in the same order, with the same participants. There was something deeply calming about being inside that, about being one of the recurring elements of an ordinary evening, rather than something outside looking in. These evenings had a quality that Arman could not have described precisely but that he recognized each time it arrived, a quality of rightness, of things being in their correct relation to each other. The three of them on the porch, the lane below, the harbor beyond that, the sea beyond that, the rain-heavy sky above it, all pressing down softly like a hand placed gently over everything. He was aware, in these moments, of time in a particular way, not of its passing, not of its pressure, but of its presence. Of being inside a moment that was happening, fully, all the way through. These were the moments, he had come to understand, that would remain. Not as memories exactly, but as a kind of knowing, a knowledge carried in the body rather than in the mind, the knowledge of what it felt like to be this, here, now, with these people, in this light. Lumi came to the harbor every few days. There was a pattern to it now, a rhythm that had established itself over the weeks since the storm, the way all rhythms establish themselves, not by decision but by repetition, by the simple fact of a thing occurring often enough that its occurrence becomes expected and its absence becomes notable. Arman had grown used to scanning the harbor surface when he arrived in the mornings, looking for the familiar shadow, for the clicking that was Lumi's particular greeting. On the mornings when it was there, he felt a small, specific pleasure that had nothing to do with the practical benefit, though the practical benefit remained reliable. It was simply the pleasure of a familiar presence. The pleasure of being remembered. The fish came more abundantly now than they had in several years. Not every day, the sea was not a machine and had never pretended to be, but across the weeks and months the pattern was one of sufficiency, of the nets coming up with enough that the household expenses were met and there was something left over for the repairs that always needed doing, and for the small things that made life comfortable rather than merely sustainable. He was able to buy proper medicine for his father. He was able to replace the section of dock planking he had been watching deteriorate for 2 seasons. He was able, without making anything of it, to begin keeping a small amount aside each month in the tin he kept behind the water jar. He and Maya did not speak directly about what was happening between them. Not for a long time. It was not avoidance, exactly, it was more the recognition, shared without discussion, that the thing between them was real enough that it did not need to be named before it was ready to be named. They were not young people in a story. They were people who had learned, each in their own way and through their own experience, to approach what mattered with care rather than urgency, to let things be what they were rather than forcing them prematurely into categories. But the care was there. It was present in 100 small ways that accumulated the way all small things accumulate, into something solid, into something that had weight and warmth and took up space in the days in the way that only real things do. It was in the way she noticed, without being told, that he took his coffee without sugar in the mornings but liked it slightly sweet in the evenings, and adjusted accordingly. It was in the way he always checked the awning ropes on her stall when he passed in the mornings, quietly, without mentioning it, tightening the ones that had worked loose overnight. It was in the way they moved around each other in the small kitchen without collision, without negotiation, as though the choreography of it had been worked out in some prior conversation that neither of them remembered having. It was in the way Rahim watched them when they were both in the room, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who knows he is seeing something true. One morning, Rahim called Arman to his room. He was sitting in the chair by the window, and the light fell across him in the gentle, early way that made his face look like something carved from a material both harder and softer than bone. He asked Arman to sit. Arman sat on the edge of the bed. His father did not speak immediately. He looked at his hands for a moment, the hands of a fisherman, which are unmistakable, which carry in their particular callosities and their particular competence the whole history of a life spent in certain kinds of work. Then he looked at his son. He said that he was glad. That was the whole of what he said, more or less. He said it with the simplicity of a man who has lived long enough to know that the most important things rarely require many words, and that the words they do require are usually the plain ones. Arman understood what he meant. He nodded once. His father reached out and touched his arm briefly, a touch that lasted only a moment and communicated things that neither of them would have found easy to say in language. Then he looked back out the window at the lane, and the birds in the hibiscus, and the light coming through the banana leaves in its shifting, watery way. Arman sat with him for a while. Then he went to start his morning. The evening that has stayed longest in the way that certain evenings stay, not because anything large happened in it, but because everything in it was exactly as it should be, came in the 5th month after the storm, on a night when the rain had been steady all day and had only recently eased to the kind of mist that is more felt than seen. They were on the porch. Rahim in his chair with the blanket. Maya beside him, and she had been showing him something on her phone, photographs from home, he gathered, from the way Rahim was leaning forward with his glasses on, asking questions about who was in each one. Arman sat on the steps with a cup of tea gone slightly cool, doing nothing in particular, which was a state he had become better at inhabiting than he once was. The lantern above the porch door gave its usual warm, imprecise light, the kind that softens everything within its range, that makes the familiar look beloved in a way it perhaps always was but does not always appear. The lane was quiet. The rain mist moved through the light in slow, drifting curtains. From somewhere in the dark beyond the hedge, a frog was calling, the same single clear note he had heard in the yard on rainy mornings all his life, patient and unhurried, one sentence repeated until the rain decided to stop. Then Lumi surfaced. They could see the harbor from the porch, or rather they could see the part of it closest to the waterfront road, the dark water, the bobbing lights of the moored boats, the long reflections of the dock lanterns lying on the surface in soft, trembling columns. And into this, from the direction of the harbor mouth, came a shape that rose above the surface in a clean, arcing leap, hung for a moment against the faint luminescence of the clouds, and fell back into the water without a sound they could hear from this distance. And then again. A second leap, in the same place, the same clean arc. Rahim made a small sound. He had lowered his glasses and was looking at the harbor with an expression that Arman had seen on his father's face before, but rarely, the expression of a man who has been given something he did not ask for and did not expect and does not know quite what to do with except receive it with the fullness it deserves. Maya had set her phone down. She was watching the water. They watched together, all three of them, from the porch, in the warm imprecise light, in the cool mist that moved through the air like something breathing, as Lumi leapt again, and again, each leap the same effortless parabola against the sky, each returned to the water a softness you could imagine rather than hear. Rahim said, very quietly, that he had not seen a dolphin in the harbor in 30 years. He said the old fisherman used to say that a dolphin in the harbor was the sea's way of telling you that the place was still good, that the water remembered its people. No one said anything for a moment after that. Then Maya put her hand over Rahim's hand on the arm of the chair, very gently, and left it there. and Rahim turned his hand over and held hers, the way an old man holds the hand of someone who has become, without any formal ceremony, without anything being declared, part of what he means when he thinks of home. Arman looked at this from the steps. He looked at the two of them in the lantern light, and he looked at the harbor where Lumi was still moving, still occasionally surfacing in that calm, unhurried way, and he felt something that he had no single word for, something that contained gratitude and peace, and an ache that was not grief but was adjacent to it, the ache that comes from being too full of something good. He picked up his cup. The tea was cool now, but he drank it anyway. Maya caught his eye over the top of Rahim's head and said nothing, only looked at him for a moment in the way she sometimes did, directly, without anything hidden in it, and then looked back at the harbor. Life, he thought. This was life. Not the version of it that announces itself with events and milestones and things you could put into a story if you were telling one. The other version. The one made of lanterns and cool tea and the sound of rain that is mostly stopped in the presence of people you love, all of you sitting in the warm and watching something beautiful move in the dark water below. In the days that followed, Lumi continued to come. Sometimes in the mornings, keeping pace with the hole in the deep water beyond the reef, leading Arman to the places where the fish gathered. Sometimes in the evenings, visible from the waterfront road as a shape moving in the harbor, unhurried, luminous, at home in the dark water the way all creatures are at home in the element they were made for. And in the house behind the waterfront, the days arranged themselves into their patterns. Arman rose before the light and went to the sea and came back. Maya came in the afternoons, and sometimes stayed through the evenings, and sometimes in the mornings he would find that she had arrived early and already made the tea and was sitting with Rahim on the porch in the first light, the two of them talking in the low, comfortable voices of people who have decided that each other's company is a good use of the hours. The rains came and went according to their own logic. The tides moved in their endless, patient cycle. The boats rocked in the harbor. The lanterns burned through the night above the docks, their light caught in the water below, trembling there like something alive. Rahim grew no younger. But he grew more peaceful, more completely and genuinely peaceful than he had been in a long time, possibly than he had been since Arman's mother died, which was a loss so old now that it had changed shape over the years from grief into something quieter, a kind of permanent tender place that did not hurt in the way it once had but was always there when you pressed against it. Maya's presence had done something to that place, not healed it. Nothing heals those places entirely, but softened the area around it, made the approaching of it less something to be avoided and more something that could be visited without cost. He spoke of Arman's mother sometimes, in the evenings, in the way he had not allowed himself to speak of her before, with pleasure, with the kind of warm and slightly rueful fondness that is available only once grief has become memory rather than wound. Maya listened to these stories with the complete, receiving attention she had for everything that mattered. She asked good questions. She remembered what she was told. And Rahim, watching her receive these stories, seemed each time to settle a little more deeply into his chair, into his blanket, into the evening, as though the stories, in being received, were doing something for him that he had not known needed doing. Arman listened to these stories too, from the steps or from the doorway, and heard in them things he had not heard before, or rather, heard them differently now, the way you hear a piece of music differently once you know something about the person who wrote it. He had grown up in his mother's absence, had learned the shape of her through photographs and the few stories his father had been able to tell in those early years when the grief was still acute. Now the stories came more freely, and they were full of detail, the way she laughed, which apparently could be heard from 2 houses down, the particular way she folded cloth, her habit of talking to the plants in the yard as though they were children who needed encouraging. Small things. But small things are the substance of a person, and Arman received each one carefully, added it to the picture he carried of her, found it becoming clearer. The morning came, and mornings always come. This is one of the things they are for. When Arman stood at the bow of the boat in the first light and looked back at the shore and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that the life he was looking at was complete. Not finished, it was not finished, it was ongoing, it would go on. The nets would need mending and the boat would need care and his father's cough would return on the cold mornings and there would be days when the catch was poor and days when the rain went on so long it tried your patience. None of that was finished and none of it would be. But complete. Complete in the way a thing is complete when it has what it needs, when all the parts that belong to it are present, are in their right relation to each other, are doing what they are meant to do. He started the engine. The familiar sound of it moved through the hull and into the soles of his feet. To his starboard side, slightly ahead, Lumi surfaced. One clean exhalation. Then the dolphin moved ahead, and paused, and looked back, or did the thing that corresponds in a dolphin's body to looking back, and then moved forward again in the direction of the open water. Arman eased the throttle forward. The boat lifted at the bow, found its pace, and moved out toward the morning. The sky to the east was beginning its slow, serious conversation with the light, still dark overhead, but at the horizon the darkness had opened a little, had made room for the earliest suggestion of what was coming. The rain of the night had quieted to nothing. The sea was very calm, the swells long and low and easy, the kind of sea that rises to meet the hull gently and puts it down again with care. Lumi moved ahead of him through the water, just visible as a shape in the dark, surfacing and diving and surfacing again in the steady rhythm of a creature that knows where it is going and is in no particular hurry to arrive, because the going is its own pleasure, the water is its own home, and the morning, whatever it brings, is simply the morning, whole and unhurried and full of the same patient abundance it has always contained. Behind him, the lights of the harbor burned on in the last of the dark. In the house above the waterfront road, a lamp was lit in the kitchen window. Behind it, a figure moved, unhurried, purposeful, at home in the small warm space, and the smell of something being prepared for the morning drifted out through the open shutter and was carried briefly by the sea air before it dissolved into the salt in the distance. The boat moved on. The sea received it. The rain, when it came again, and it would come again, it always did. This was a place where the rain was as constant and as necessary as breath, would fall on all of it equally, without preference, without judgment. On the harbor and the boats and the docks. On the banana leaves and the lane and the hibiscus hedge. On the porch where 3 people sat in the evenings and watched the water. On the dark sea where a dolphin and a fisherman moved together through the early morning toward whatever the day was quietly and generously preparing to offer. And somewhere in a warm room above the waterfront, with the rain on the roof and the smell of tea in the air and the sound of the sea always just beneath everything else, a good man and a kind woman and a peaceful old father would find themselves held, as they were held each night, in the ordinary and extraordinary grace of a life that had room in it for all of them. Let your breath settle now, slow and even, in and out. There is nothing complicated about this. Simply breathe. Simply be here in the dark, in the warmth, in the weight of your own body, in the quiet that the night has made for you. You have carried enough today. You do not need to carry it further into sleep. Think, if you like, of the harbor. Of the lanterns burning above the water. Of the boats rocking in that slow, patient rhythm, each one connected to the dock by its lines, held in place, going nowhere tonight, at rest. Think of the surface of the water with its small, overlapping circles where the rain is falling, appearing and dissolving, each one complete in itself and then gone, replaced by the next, and the next, and the next, an endless continuity of small things that ask nothing of you except to be witnessed, and even that only if you wish. Let your thoughts do what they want to do now. Let them drift, let them slow, let them become less attached to sequence and logic in the shape of complete sentences. Let them become more like water. More like rain. More like the sound of a boat rocking at its mooring in the dark, going nowhere, content. There is nothing left for you to do tonight. The sea is quiet. The rain is soft. The lanterns are burning. Everyone you need to think of is safe and at rest. Let your body grow heavy. Let your thoughts grow loose and drift, the way the boats drift when the tide comes in gently and there is nothing for the mooring lines to resist. The harbor is still. The rain falls. The dolphin moves in the dark water somewhere beyond the reef, luminous and unhurried, at home. And you, too, are home. You are warm and you are held and there is nowhere else to be. Sleep now. Sleep,